What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to the Mining Pod. Today, we've got a special show for you with Denis Rusinovich, the CEO of Cryptocurrency Mining Group, a Bitcoin mining research and advisory firm. We're going to be talking about Russia's Bitcoin mining ban that has been making the rounds on the media circuit and clear up some of the misconceptions with this story. So for context, a story broke last week on December 23rd. We recorded this on December 30th. That Russia bans cryptocurrency mining in 10 regions until 2031, restricts in 3 more. Now, the actual story here is not that Russia is wholesale banning cryptocurrency mining, but it is restricting it in certain regions for certain miners. So the so-called cowboy miners, as I like to call them, are retail miners and smaller miners who are tapping into residential power and not reporting their operations to the Russian authorities. And those miners will be completely swept out as a result of this ban. Whereas the industrial scale miners and some of the larger ones who actually have reported and are known by the government, they will be allowed to operate with certain restrictions in certain regions, as Denis covers in this pod. I think that's really important context, and it again goes to show that when stories come out of the East, they always get misrepresented in some way in the West for a number of reasons, for language barrier and information barrier and all that stuff. So this was a really good pod, I think, for clearing up some of the misconceptions, for getting some information out there about what exactly this ban means for Bitcoin mining in Russia and the future of the industry. And for those of you expecting a juicy difficulty drop from a ban blanket in Russia against Bitcoin mining, you're probably not going to get it, as Denis explains in this pod. All right, I won't belabor this any longer, and without further ado, here's the episode.
Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com. Thanks for listening to the Mining Pod. Want more? Subscribe to our main feed on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts for another weekly show on Bitcoin stocks. And check out our newsletter at miningpod.blockspace.media today.
Denis, welcome to the Mining Pod, man. How you doing?
Thank you, Colin. I'm great. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining. A hot button topic, obviously, a lot of buzz around Russia's mining ban, potentially big implications for Bitcoin's hash rate. Probably not as much as the China mining ban, which took out about half of the hash rate and led to a huge drop in difficulty and a subsequent surge to hash price, but still a major mining region. So we wanted to get you on to talk about what exactly is happening and some of the backdrop and context that we were talking about before the call about how Kazakhstan is kind of in the shadows here, informing a lot of what's going on. But to start out, before we get into some of the context, can you explain for our listeners exactly what this ban is? Because it seems like a region by region ban, but not a blanket ban on Russia totally. So what exactly is going on?
Well, basically, you need to look at the actual sequence of events. And the one which was prior to this ban was actually on more focused on legislation change, which sort of made it more legalizing the whole mining in the country. And so the subsequent step was obviously eliminating the regions which were, let's put it traditionally, were not supposed to have a mining, or they actually were developed more on the legal side. And if you look at specifically, there is actually 2 categories of regions which were identified. One is a complete ban. And mostly, actually, it's focused on the Caucasus region. You know, you have a Dagestan, Ingushetia, Abkhazia, basically this Chechnya. So this is the regions which were traditionally, let's put it this way. I think the simplest way to explain it, this is the terrain there is a mountain terrain. You know, you have a sort of more limited sort of transmission lines capabilities, and obviously much more sort of capable infrastructure to support the high loads. And obviously the illegal mining which came in, actually they jeopardized the system. And this is where it's led the government eventually, you know, sort of to do a full crackdown on the illegal mining. And that's why some of these regions they will see sort of more or less permanent ban going forward. And there is a second category, which if you look, it was traditionally the Irkutsk region, was let's say let's put in Russia, it was like in Texas in US, where basically they saw the massive activities, over the last 5-7 years, large hosting sites developing. This part of the region actually was put under the restriction, and restriction is operating on a quarterly basis. So basically, for the next, let's say, till 2031, they're saying that there is going to be a ban from 1st of January to I think is mid-March, where basically it's a peak time, and then later in the year, I think it's November, December. So this is actually, yeah, exactly. So exactly, and I think this is where you need to look, because this is the regions which is south of Siberia, which is basically getting affected exactly because of the climate sort of let's say the fluctuations that are taking place, and also those regions are actually, especially the Irkutsk, they're actually more engaged in at times into the export of energy if needed, because this was traditionally very sort of rich region in terms of the hydro resources, and this is as well as a large hub for industrial clusters. There is a lot of industrial, not only residential. So I think this is where the government actually identified the certain hubs, regional, which have a sort of limitations at the moment and going forward, and basically put forward this proposal. They obviously might adjust it, but I think it's more will be dependent on the new generation coming online, or maybe some of the big consumers sort of dropping off. But this is the second category. The first category will remain as under the ban. I think that's and this already can be seen that law enforcement agencies trying to sort of jump in, and close them
and shut down some mines. So a lot of stuff to touch on here. Just to recap, the first category are outright bans in regions where miners weren't really supposed to be operating. And the second category are restrictions in legal regions. That's not an outright ban, but basically saying there are going to be blackout periods. As you said, I think to start, it'll be January 1st to March 15th, according to this TASS article that broke the news. And then going forward until 2031, it'll be from November until March 15th. So, and another thing to touch on, you said this whole business of the news headline that said Russia has legalized Bitcoin mining. You're saying what that basically was, that legislation was showing which regions they are okay with mining operating in and which regions they aren't. It wasn't necessarily legalizing it. It was basically setting the groundwork for saying you can do it here, but you can't do it here. Is that right?
The legalizing already taken place. From the 1st of November, basically the system was rolled out. That basically all the miners operating in Russia, a tax authority established two categories: basically the hosting providers, the owners of infrastructure with data centers, and the actual miners, the owners of the miners, the hash rate generating. So they said you have to register, and by 1st of January, basically you are supposed to be in one list or another. And this is the sort of regulation that already kicked in parallel to the ban. And I think this is what was synchronized process. They obviously synchronized it. They were pushing people out to go under the regulatory umbrella, at the same time saying, okay, guys, if you are operating in the regions, and this is not like came out as a surprise. People were expecting, the speculations were there already for a few months in certain regions, especially which are supposed to go under the restriction. But some obviously waited, some prepared, but we see in a second.
So the November 1st thing was basically setting the stage for this, trying to get miners to register with the government, partially so that they could know where they are and figuring out which ones were going to play ball and be compliant. Is that a good way to think about it? Or
I think you should look at more on a systemic level. I think that is going to be a clear register of all the legal entities in Russia which are operating in one category or another. And this is done for a few purposes, obviously, that it's cross-checked that all the hardware is imported legally, and then basically they're registered as large consumers. They do understand exactly which region and which companies basically operating. And this is we're talking, I mean, some of these mining sites were consuming like aluminium power plants, which is, so this is quite an important, especially like if energy security is vital for many regions nowadays. And I think this is what also was a logical step for them, to follow.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one last question before we move on to Kazakhstan as context. Before all of these regulations and laws were put into place and now this ban, how many miners would you say were operating like legally, or, were doing it in a way that was where they were reporting to the government, where the power companies knew what they were doing? How much mining was actually, for lack of a better word, like kosher, and how much wasn't? Like, was it most people just kind of coming in and plugging up and then not really trying to like cause much, be so open about it?
I'll probably will need to group them into different categories so that it automatically makes it pretty clear for you. I mean, you have a group of more institutional type of players, which let's say, which was reaching level 50 plus megawatts. They obviously took a much more active position, in the policy dialogue, through association with different sort of engagement with the government. They understood it. I think one of them, an example you had it, I think it was the actual leader before it got sanctioned by OFAC. It was a Bit River.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you know that. I mean, quite unfortunately, I mean, I think approximately probably 50 to 70 megawatt of hardware was lost inside Russia, actually, from Western investors, because of that. But this was one of the groups which was initially, back in 2020, leading. Then we had a few other ones which joined, which grown. We can single out maybe like 5, large players in a country which, let's say, which took a step to be more visible. The issue with Russia was always that even if how it was even covered in analytical research, its actual limitations to disclosure of information. Many of them was trying to stay, in a, not to do any sort of PR, trying to stay in the shadow. And I think this is where basically we have an issue at the moment still. That's actually going forward. We're going to see more miners in mid-size, stepping out, with more publicity, transparency. And I think this was missing. But let's put the first category, industrial level. We have like 5 to 10 large miners, with 50, 100 megawatt operation and over. Then you have a mid-size, which is basically opportunity-based, this is where you have a 10, 20 megawatt. And then you have a lot of, let's say, retail, and this is actually which is going under a massive ban, especially in the regions, which is basically and I give you an example. Some of them, like it was a business model where placing 2-3 units, randomly across the flats, and this is quite a disturbing event for the government, especially like the pressure it puts on the residential energy infrastructure,
Right, and so that makes sense. So the residential miners and the retail ones are kind of at the center of this conflict because that's load that they can't really measure very well. Right?
And I give you an example. This is actually, this is more, it's not only in Russia. If you look at, for example, Indonesia, Malaysia, there's a lot of regions where you have a subsidized tariff for the residential areas. And in Russia, for example, it's 4 or 5 times lower than a normal tariff because it's subsidized by the government. And this is people, in a way, it's actually classified more as a sort of a theft because you're actually stealing energy, which is not supposed to be for residential, for business purposes. And this is why we're trying to change it. Say now, if you're operating on a large scale, you should register as a business and pay the taxes. It's okay. And then you pay the right tariff rather than trying to abuse the system, and load the local residential, transformers, which are not supposed to be running 24/7 on a maximum load.
Right. So does that mean that we should see these residential and retail miners get swept out, but the industrial players might still be allowed to operate?
Exactly. This is going to be the Russia will be going under the massive transformation through 2025, where you're going to see the wave of this illegal mining, left out, and then basically the mid-size and the top operators, going more as a sort of business and industrial scale miners, and which actually will not be any longer afraid to be transparent. It's very likely you're going to see, at least on a local level in Russia, where they're trying to reposition themselves, to open up, because they obviously will be interested to expand. It becomes more institutional business, for them as well.
Today's show is brought to you by Digital Shovel. Digital Shovel is a leading manufacturer of modular mining pods as well as PDUs and switchgears. Unlike many other competitors, their product is designed and manufactured in North America with a complete UL inspection on the entire unit, not just individual components. Additionally, Digital Shovel is one of the most vertically integrated manufacturers of over 75,000 square feet of sheet metal shop, SMT and wave solder PCB assembly, as well as final assembly all under one roof in Toronto, Canada. Their price point leads the industry when compared to products with rates as low as $69,000 per megawatt for a complete data center with smart PDUs and switchgears. To learn more, visit digitalshovel.com. So that's interesting, and it underscores, I think, something about this whole, again, a lot of this stuff gets lost in translation, and what this headline belies is that there's going to be a hash rate blackout in Russia, but it sounds like that might not necessarily happen, and so this might not even really affect global network hash rate that much. I mean, there's going to be some hash rate coming offline in Russia, but if the big guys are just now more tightly regulated and they're still going to be allowed to operate, just curtailing at certain times, this probably won't have a huge effect. Do you feel that way, or?
Well, I don't think we're going to have an effect like we had in China, when a shutdown took place, or when was an accident, if you remember, on a coal mine at one point,
yes.
Or in Texas where it was the winter freeze, and then was
right.
I think we do going to have some effect because Irkutsk did had a lot, especially, let's say, the grain. I think Irkutsk is a region where actually even the industrial miners might be affected because of this seasonal ban, until March.
Right.
But overall, I think, the retail definitely will be sort of swiped away. We might have, but it's not going to be so drastic, that's to the level.
That makes sense. All right, let's get to Kazakhstan really quickly, because this was an interesting point you brought up in our little pre-call meeting, or pre-pod meeting, I should say. So how did Kazakhstan serve as kind of the backdrop or the testing ground for this kind of regulation?
It's not I don't think it's a testing ground, because Kazakhstan had its own way of going,
right.
And I think that there was Kazakhstan was a pioneer, probably. If I look globally, it's a good use case to certain things how they were done correctly and incorrectly as well, because it did, through the policy dialogue, Kazakhstan established the most important part, which is that the regulation. So where you become a miners, i.e. the industrial sites, the hosting providers, and the miners themselves become part of the economic system, i.e. there is a budget sort of allocation, there's a tax codes which are corresponding to this. So basically for the government planning, they can even see this sort of industry is actually what is generating, what's economic benefits it does. And this is what actually Kazakhstan was doing. And also one other thing that it basically did, which not many regions are actually still pursuing, is actually enforced to bring the profit center back into the Kazakhstan. Because if you look in many jurisdictions, they're saying that they're crypto, Bitcoin mining sites. Look at the Nordic, Scandinavia. It's only the back end of it, because you only have a data center, because the hash rate actually it's generated, and usually it's, let's say, the actual Bitcoin and the hash rate formation takes outside of the region, and it means the profit center is actually outside. So you only have a back end of it, which is the data center and the servers, let's say the miners, where we're lucky. But the BTC sort of trading part is taking place in a jurisdiction which allows, the crypto fiat, transactions to take place. And this is what Kazakhstan eventually did, because before, if you're mining in Kazakhstan, and you want to operate, you have to structure, in Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, because in Kazakhstan, there was no banking infrastructure to support you. Now they enforce it. So technically there is a venues registered license in Kazakhstan where you actually can liquidate the BTC, basically do a transaction, basically. And this is what they've done as well. They did this pioneering at the same time, through that progress, they strangled the sector maybe, to certain degrees, and this is made an effect. And Russia, what I wanted to say, why I made this reference, Russia was observing, what was done, and that's why, like, I was fascinating to see. I had a conversation with few people. We said, no, we're going to have our own way. And eventually we did implement even the categories. It's exactly the same what was in Kazakhstan, and they implemented, they tried still a bit more relaxed, I think, in terms of actual BTC liquidation policies. But let's see going forward what will happen, But but that was an interesting sort of reference case, at least for the region.
When you said the categories, you mean like industrial, smaller size, residential? Is that what you mean by categories, or?
No. There is inside the categories. There is because the Bitcoin mining consists only of two categories, two components: the infrastructure, the data center, and the infrastructure, and then the hash rate formation, And this is where the categories are, because you can be supporting.
So just to clarify, you like host versus the people who own the machines.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. The hosting providers, and they're also making reference to that. The hosting providers or the actual miners, and you actually can be in one category or another,
Okay.
If you do proprietary, you're gonna need to register two entities,
And Kazakhstan's regulations, you said, basically choked out the industry, right? I mean, a lot of miners ended up leaving because it became too difficult or too expensive.
It was actually before the regulation kicked in. That was an energy crisis that took place in January 21. That strangled and it's actually started before that. It started, I think, in October 21. It started actually before that, because they made a restriction for miners to operate, and it was dragging on for 6 months. The continuous prolongation, 2 more weeks, and we will put you back online. And this is when many miners left, and then they never sort of came back. But at the same time, there is a large infrastructure already developed in Kazakhstan. And I think with the regulation kicking in, it's probably, let's put it this way, still the safest environment from a regulatory point of view, especially for international players as well. I mean, you, for example, can come and register a company there, establish your operations. Maybe the tariff will not be like it was 5 years ago, but still, it's pretty transparent system, and there is still mining there, and I think it still continues. Maybe with some sort of adjustments, because you have more now coming through the gas generation capacity, where traditionally it was from other sources.
Is there a real energy crisis going on in Russia currently that is mandating this? Like, why is this ban coming now?
I think it's not the actual, it's hard to say that Russia will have an energy crisis. It's
right.
so self-sufficient in the multiple sources of energy. I'll tell you, like, the whole situation that we had developing from, let's say, from 22, it's made such drastic adjustments on the energy flows that we have across the Europe. This is where it's created a surplus or disbalance in certain regions. For example, I'll give you an example. Up north in Murmansk region, which was traditionally exporting to Finland over 1 gigawatt, that was shut down. And it was shut down, obviously coincidental with 22 events, but at the same time, Finland actually was rolling out its own nuclear power plant. For 1.2 gigawatt, which obviously was supposed to compensate this supply anyway. So if you look, for example, that region, you can imagine, in Russia, up north, there is a 1 gigawatt of spare energy, which either needs to be, it cannot be any more longer exported to Europe. It's actually has to be sort of transmitted down south. And this is where
they have transmission lines set up for it?
Yeah, of course. You can probably still see it on energy maps on across sort of European integration. There is.
Can they send it easily down south? Like, are there already transmission lines?
There is. But again, you can. the transmission, is going to be a losses, and then you need to the consumer on the back of it, and this is obviously creating some disbalance. There is a certain disbalance on the south region because it was been growing, and plus the whole Ukraine development is also obviously because there is obviously there was a cross flows before, which was also cut off, so this is definitely, I think, making a certain impact, on especially like the European borderline. But you should not forget that, for example, at the same time, the Kazakhstan is also one of the options was even for the miners there. For example, if you want to be operating without an option be shut down, you because there is a priority for which sectors get shut down in case of the peak load. If you import it from outside of Kazakhstan, you will not be. And this is obviously the only way to import it is from Russia. I don't know if anyone doing this, but this was also an option which is available.
Am I right in understanding or assuming that maybe the regions that rely more on oil more on gas and coal might be having energy deficits currently because of the conflict in Ukraine, or is that not even a problem? Because I'm trying to wrap my mind around, like, it seems like they're trying to do this energy balancing game within their country, right? There are certain regions that have so much energy they can't do anything with it except for send it down to the rest of the country. They also have Bitcoin mines up there, but they're trying to make sure that they can actually supply enough energy to all of the different regions in Russia. And each region has its own base load, right? A lot of hydro, exactly. It sounds like in the north. And I would assume that maybe the south.
It's south. Yeah. This is I can give you elaboration on that because the south, even Irkutsk is the south. It's a cold place, but it's the south place of Russia.
Okay.
There is actually north part, and I give you this is also an example because you obviously in any region globally. There's more people living on the south than on the north. Obviously, this is the same for Siberia. They're living on the south. This is much more intensive, and obviously wherever people live in, you have an industries, and this is a traditional, and going forward, this is a regions which always will be requiring more and more energy. But in Russia, there is actually interesting development taking place because there is a certain groups, because that's, for me, was a fascinating event to see it. Because, for example, Beat River was a great example, if we didn't have a 2022, we probably would be one of the leaders, in Russia by now. But they were in a region which was rich in hydro, and they were quite advanced in that. But at the same time, other players, some of them went up north, towards the Arctic line, because there is another development which was taking place as oil and gas business, develops, the deposit, it starts moving north. Obviously we're starting from extraction, and as they sort of going through the cycle, maybe 20 years, they go to the new deposits. And this is traditionally, this is actually, they're moving north. What it means as they're moving, they're leaving out all this energy infrastructure which was done. And it was for oil and gas businesses is a massive, you have a transformers, transmission lines. There is even the ecosystem of cities, that basically was supporting this. And this is what basically the potential is developing, that the miners can go in and actually, and probably government will encourage them, that, you should not be on the south, and trying to restrict the energy use, for the traditional sort of residential industrial sectors, move somewhere else where basically there is plenty of energy and a space for you, And this could be
push the miners up to those places.
They're not pushing. They basically naturally, I think that is occurring. And some miners actually maybe the visionary enough. They already were moving in that direction. Obviously, that let's say. Year and a half, 2 years ago, if you would say someone, I'm moving very north, people would say, no, it's a bit of a hassle because of a logistic, additional, steps that we need to take, placing the hardware. But now it's actually becoming a competitive advantage for these guys,
In the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark. America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale, we've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
And up there in the north, so I have two questions from this. And the second one will be about which regions have the most mining going on, but I feel like we've touched on that a little bit. I just want to clarify for our listeners. Up north, you said with the oil and gas. Are these oil and gas fields? Like, would this be off-grid mining, or are these massive refineries and actual gas-powered power plants?
It's not only off-grid. It's a proper developed grid infrastructure. That's been there. Yeah.
Are there many people living up there? I mean, but they just basically built natural gas power plants and coal power plants because they need to get energy to these people, but there aren't as many consumers. There's not as much industry.
It's mostly on the industry side because let's say if you're going up to the north, it's exactly the same. If you look at Kazakhstan, Sweden, Norway, you always have the same issue. You have a excess energy supply on the north, not enough people in the industries, trying to adjust, and this is what is there as well. You have an industry, as we're moving up, we're leaving the infrastructure, this is what can be taken up by the miners,
Okay.
And we're not talking about off-grid because, this is quite a challenging environment, just create, 100 plus megawatt, off-grid,
Yeah, for sure. A lot of, a very frigid and unforgiving environment up in northern Siberia. So with regards to which regions see the most mining activity, you've mentioned the Irkutsk region. You've also mentioned Chechnya. Which regions would you say?
Chechnya said it because under the ban it was not supposed to have it,
Oh, okay. But was there a lot going on there? Was there a lot going on in Chechnya?
There is a lot in Caucasus. Well, at least, you see from the headlines, you always finding, maybe you also saw with some crazy videos, people were digging the tunnels, hiding the mining farms under the ground, not to make noise. People went very creative there, and and at the same time, or for example, there is a lot of, on Caucasus, there is a lot of small hydropower plants. And then this is actually maybe would be an interesting reference to some of the regions which marketed, maybe also I saw in Africa and other regions where we're saying that, okay, Bitcoin mining can, be an additional, but they did not help, because actually what it did eventually, the commercial aspect of mining drives people to utilize the maximum energy, and this is putting the actual blackouts for the regions, for the neighbors, for the villages,
right. And those are mostly those kind of like cowboy miners, the residential or retail ones. So, but with regard, just like wholesale, which regions would you say have the most activity? And if you could put your finger on it, roughly how much hash rate or how many megawatts is currently active in Russia?
Well, let's say if I look on in industrial scale, I'll say probably close to 2 gigawatt probably but let's say from a mining the small, it's hard to let's say to do a guesstimate, but I would say probably Irkutsk, the region had quite a big footprint, because there was not only because of illegal, but it was a large number of data centers there. The sort of the normal data centers. And that's why I think we will see probably a big drop in that region on this sort of retail, semi-retail, cowboy mining. And I think obviously going forward was going to be some sort of a shutdown in Caucasus, but this is hard to understand, because let's put it this way. I don't see that in a small, region villages, they're able to use 10 megawatt capacity, in a single place. It's more likely, we're trying to absorb whatever is portion available, and then this is usually work for the local policeman, law enforcement agency, trying to to hear where the sound is coming from and trying to shut them down. And at the same time, there is already tools available through sort of scanning of the telco basically channels to understand, or for example, we do the energy mapping on energy utilization. This is also possible. So I'm sure.
So for industrial mining, Irkutsk is probably the biggest region. Are there other regions that come to mind for industrial scale mining?
On industrial scale, you'll see Murmansk region. This is up north. Khanty-Mansiysk, this is a traditional oil and gas, the massive oil and gas. So I think going forward, in Russia, we definitely will see this northern regions,
So you think that's the future of the mining industry in there? And are a lot of miners already moving their operations to these regions?
There is already miners which, as I said, some of them were visionary enough, to step into that direction, and I think this is what will be happening, that there's going to be more hosting sites available to support even maybe some of national migration, because, you should understand that these miners which were there, they're not going to be able to freely take out the hardware from a country. This is it's not like they can put it in a container and ship it outside.
Yeah, that's for sure. Just a one housekeeping question. How does I don't even want to call it a ban, because it seems like, again, it's a ban on illegal mining. But how do the restrictions or new legislation affect hosts versus the miners themselves? Like, is there any difference, or is it basically just you need to register, you both have to pay your respective taxes? Is there any sort of differences in the way that they're approaching both of those categories?
It's interesting that they made they incorporated the balancing mechanism inside that making you responsible. For example, if you're a hosting provider, you are actually responsible to make sure that all your clients are actually registered. So basically, this way, they reduce the burden of tax authorities, law enforcement, trying to chase them. They're saying, guys, for us, it's much easier to localize the mining sites, and they're registered. So if we come and we check, and basically you have a X number of clients which are not within the register, then obviously it's going to be your issue as well as theirs.
That makes sense. And what are the taxes roughly? Like what do you know the percentage or how the tax breaks down?
You mean on corporate tax or no VAT?
Yeah, corporate tax, I guess. Yeah,
I think it was 20%.
So there's not necessarily like a special tax for mining. It's just you have to make sure you're paying the corporate tax.
Yeah, okay. You register as a company, and I think that's also. I think that it's also one important component is that if you are in some special economic zones, they also might remove your restrictions, because what they are trying to encourage is that if you are a business and you establish it as a business, you should pay the corporate tax. That's why basically they're trying to eliminate all this semi-legal mining, and introduce just one sort of one for all category that you just pay the tax and that's it.
Dennis, just a few more questions and then I'll let you go. This has been a really illuminating conversation. I really appreciate it. You were quoted by us in one of our newsletters a while back. This newsletter about a hashrate arms race is gearing up between China and Russia. And you had mentioned that there's a lot of deal flow from ASIC brokers into the region. Some other contacts that we had said the same thing. When I was at Bitmain's World Digital Mining Summit last year in Hong Kong, I talked to a number of people that said that more than 50% of their deal flow is going into Russia. Bitmain was saying similar things. Where is this deal flow coming from? Is this mostly from Russian investors and entrepreneurs? Is there capital flowing in from outside of Russia, from China or other Eastern countries? Who are the primary players in the region?
I'll tell. It's probably, if you look at the dynamic, maybe from 22, it did change, because it was primarily was a Russian flow, and was dominated even now. Because, and this is just an investment case. It's, again, I like to make a references. Look at China. China had the mining because that was one of the best way of investing in capital restricted environment to creating an asset which was more transferable outside. And this is what China was actually doing. You could buy the miner inside the China, plug it in, and then basically it generates for you a BTC, which is uncontrollable to the government. And then this is obviously was a part of development as well in Russia. That's I don't want to say it is illegal. It was it's gray area. You mine, you still pay the hosting fee. But what did change? Let's say the 22 was the shock wave for many, because of whole geopolitical shift. But I think what we see now is, let's say, the things are settling down. There is a clear sort of multipolar development, especially with the BRICS countries. There is actually more external investment from outside that are interested in hosting in Russia. Because if you look, for example, nowadays there is if you're interested in mining and you don't come from US or Russia, you start looking for what's available option for you. You have Latin America, you have Africa, you'll say, okay, maybe, and then you're just making a judgment call saying, okay, is it friendly environment for me in US or is it friendly environment for me in Russia? And this is, I think, what's going to be also driving some of the hash rate growth, because you understand that the whole environment, and it did change even for China. Because I remember back in 2020, you will speak and people say, Russia, no. Kazakhstan is okay because Kazakhstan was creating visibility. But this is probably will be the case now for Russia, as you're going to have a more institutional sort of industrial scale operators. They might actually attract a lot of investments, and actually this investors interested in mining from BRICS, countries as an option. This is definitely could be a new wave.
That makes sense. And so most of the actual infrastructure, I would assume, is run by Russian companies. Like a Russian company stands up like 100 megawatt facility, and then they fill that rack space with ASICs from outside investors and outside miners.
Yeah, exactly. You already have a few players in Russia, basically, that operate in, the Bit River. There is the other one was a bit cluster. You saw them expanding into Ethiopia. These guys were trying to sort of step out. There's actually bigger groups that actually went up to the north on Arctic, sort of Arctic Circle part, which is a mining cluster. That's and then you have other, I think, gold mining was another one which started from Russia, but now sort of trying to expand outside. So, but yeah, and Bit River, but Bit River actually is interesting because it's actually getting affected now because of this scale down limit restrictions that's applying, because their prime sort of location is actually Irkutsk region. So let's see how they are developing.
Yeah, for sure. So what's the future for mining in Russia? Do you expect Russia to continue to see the kind of level of growth that it has experienced over the last few years? Do you think these restrictions really slow it down? Or do you think this is just creating more clarity for future expansion for mining companies in the region?
I would say Russia was and will remain number two. It was originally number two in hash rate after China, and then the switch to US. I think it will still remain number two because I don't see any other location globally that will be able to take this leadership position, from them. And then the other thing that it might get affected in terms of the flow of hash rate, let's say, which was traditionally from this sort of quasi-retail type. I think that's going to be a switch because, and that will be switched more towards the institutional allocation because they're more transparent, business structures. So we might have a dip slightly, let's say, initially, but overall, I think Russia will grow its hash rate for sure.
Makes sense. All right, last question, Denis. Is there actually a decent amount of oil and gas mining happening in Russia? Or is that not really a big part of the mining industry in that country?
At the moment, I think there is the gas. Well, let's say through the gas generation, yes, there is a large development, especially up north. Where the regions with oil and gas. There is some developments of off-grid sites. And I think that will be continuing. But again, this is different type of setups, and especially in remote locations, it's challenging. But let's see. I think there will be continued developing there as well.
Well, Denis, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Where can people find you and the cryptocurrency mining group?
Well, I think the best is on Twitter, D Rusinovich in Twitter, and
it's BTC Mining Group, right?
Yeah. BTC
Fantastic.
Mining Group, yeah.
Well, Denis, thank you so much for hopping on, man. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a happy new year, and hope to have you on the pod again sometime soon. This was great.
Have a happy new year, Yaxel. Take care.